It's really an avoidance mechanism, because the truth is that you're terrified of the target. So you do anything and everything but the thing that you're supposed to be working on. And you go out of your way to try to perfect every single aspect of what it is that you're ostensibly working on in order to avoid actually doing the thing that you're supposed to be working on. It's the lie that you tell yourself to excuse the failure to produce.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Grad Coach Podcast. My name is Derek, and today Dr. E and I are speaking about perfectionism, that little or sometimes not so little monster that we all struggle with to some extent. Specifically, we're going to unpack 3 straightforward practices that you can implement to conquer perfectionism and get your project moving forward. So let's get this thing started. Dr. E, welcome back to the pod.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, man.
Dr. E, why is perfectionism such a monster? Why are we dedicating an entire podcast to talking about how to beat this thing?
I don't know. First of all, let me just say, I don't know that I'm necessarily the right one to ask this question of, because I don't know if you've seen, for the people who don't watch this on YouTube, you're missing out. But this lineup, perfectionism, I don't know what to tell you, man. There's levels and then there's this. But no, okay. The principal problem with perfectionism is the distraction that it presents more than anything else. So the idea of perfectionism is this idea that you want everything that you do to be perfect in every single way, in order that cumulatively the work that you produce is this perfect expression of the ideal version of everything that you're trying to achieve or trying to get across. It's a misunderstanding, ultimately, both of what you're trying to achieve and how to achieve it. More than that, it's really an avoidance mechanism, because the truth is that you're terrified of the target. So you do anything and everything but the thing that you're supposed to be working on. And you go out of your way to try to perfect every single aspect of what it is that you're ostensibly working on in order to avoid actually doing the thing that you're supposed to be working on. In other form, it's the lie that you tell yourself to excuse the failure to produce. That's really what it boils down to. So I'm actually perfecting what I'm doing. I'm getting all my ducks in a row. I just need to make sure my pens are in perfect order. I just need to make sure that I've answered all of my emails before I get to the work that I'm supposed to be doing. I know that's triggering for both of us. It's cool. We'll get to that. But all of those things is that this idea of perfectionism tends to precede procrastination, putting aside the alliteration. It's still true, because it's designed principally to distract you from the goal of what you're supposed to be trying to produce.
It is very much the enemy of action, and we're certainly not proposing that you lower your standards and just settle for rubbish work. But there is, to use our forbidden word, there is a balance of some sort. And so in this podcast, we're going to talk about some of those practices, or some of the practices that you could implement to beat perfectionism, or at least to balance it in some way. So let's jump into it. And practice number 1, which we have titled oh so smoothly, is that you need to let perfection be your muse, not your master. So, Dr. E, why do you need perfection to be your muse and not your master? How does that help you beat it?
I'm self-conscious now with the perfectionism thing that we're already talking about, but I'm trying to avoid any further alliteration. I think I burnt it out in the first segment, but I'm so tempted to just keep going. So if this comes up again for both the visual viewers and for the audio listeners, I apologize, but letting perfectionism be your muse as opposed to your master. The first thing to say here is there's an intellectual step, which is to say it's the recognition that your work is always going to have flaws. In fact, it will necessarily have flaws. It must be the case, because perfection, if you really understand what it is that we're talking about, and this is why I say this is the intellectual step, perfection is not attained. It's not something that you acquire. Perfection is realized. It's something that you see or something that you discover. It's the moment. It's the common phrasing, you see something beautiful, you see something perfect, you see something glorious, you say, that's perfect. It's one of those things. It's not something that somebody attains or something somebody holds over the course of time. So it's not only pointless as a goal, but it's obviously pointless, because you've always known this was the case. You've always known that perfection wasn't something that you acquired, but something that you discovered over the course of time. You know the work that you do, that you're supposed to be doing, the work that you're trying to produce is the product, is the positive impact, is the good news, as it were, to kind of use religious language. But the work that you're doing is exactly what you're trying to achieve, as opposed to the goal itself. The work that you're putting in, that's what makes it so perfect. That's what makes that moment when you realize that you've done something amazing so rewarding, not the immediacy of being able to produce a perfect step at every single stage of the process. I mean, if you think about it, when was the last time you were perfect the first time you did something? It's never been the case. And when was the last time you regretted the journey towards your improvement? That's never been the case. Nobody ever looks back at their time improving over the course of time thinking, I hated that journey. How terrible was it that I started off terribly and I got better over the course of time? Nobody feels that way. And by equal measure, nobody ever does something and then immediately does it perfectly. And when those instances do occur, you don't learn anything from it. You walk away from that and it never occurs to you again. The likelihood is that you get it perfect the first time, you're going to make the mistake the second time. You get it perfect the second time, you're going to make a bigger mistake the third time. You're better off making those mistakes early on than you are pursuing perfection in the first instance of trying to do a thing.
I think another way to conceptualize it is that perfection or the perfect outcome, the perfect dissertation can be an inspiration, but not an obsession. And you might say, okay, well, that's a nice little set of words, but what does it mean in practical terms? How do we distinguish between inspiration and obsession? And I think probably the clearest marker is whether or not your inspiration inspires you to take action or it freezes you in inaction as a product of procrastination or by way of procrastination. And so action is really the key word here. Is you can set your sights high. I mean, if you listen to this podcast, Dr. E, that's your gospel, man. Like, it's all about setting your sights high. And that's great. Aim for perfection, fine. But don't become obsessed with it. It's the terrible overused cliche of aim for the moon, and if you fail, you'll land in the stars or something like that. Terrible. And I don't even remember it properly. But the essence of that is 100% true. Is aim high, but don't become obsessed with perfection. Don't become obsessed with producing this perfect document that everything needs to be 100% right. And the way that you know you're striking the right balance there is, are you taking action? Which we'll talk a little bit more about a little later.
No, I totally agree with you. I'm not going to go so far as to say what you said was perfect. See? But it was pretty damn good. So here's what I mean. It's not to say that perfection is not a compelling goal. I mean, no one aims at a target and tries not to hit the bullseye. Like, that's not a thing. Like, nobody sees a target and thinks, okay, but if I hit just left of the bullseye, that will be great. Nobody does that. You see a bullseye, you see a target, and the intention is to hit the very, 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 very center of it. In fact, the intention is to split the arrow that did hit the center of it. You're trying to be the best of the best of the best at what you do. The point is, it's not that that's not the case. I mean, you guys heard the introduction to this podcast. I'm really going to be the one to tell you that we shouldn't be aiming for perfection. Like, this is me, really? Like you said, it's kind of my gospel. Like, you should be aiming to do really, really well, but that's not what I'm saying. It's not about whether or not you set it as your target. It's whether or not it becomes an obsession or it's an actual function. And the difference between those things is a question of production. So whether or not the intention or the aim or the target of perfection is impeding production. And if it's not impeding production and you are constantly producing and making mistakes and improving as you make your way towards that goal, that is how you get closer and closer and closer to perfection. If, on the other hand, exactly as you said, it's one of those things that tends to be an impediment for you to your working, well, now we have a problem. I mean, it's a question of the comfort that one has with missing the target and making mistakes. It's the idea that, okay, if I am aiming at that bullseye and I don't hit it on the first time of asking, I bet you I'm going to get closer on the second. And I bet you I'm going to get closer still on the third. And even if I do hit the bullseye on the third, I bet you I'm going to do it again on the fourth. I bet you I'm going to do it again on the fifth. Like, there's layers and levels to perfection. I don't know why we set our sights so low. It's not about hitting the mark of the first time of asking. It's about being able to hit the mark every single time. And that does take practice. And that does take production. And that does take making mistakes. As I said, it's the comfort you have with making those errors. There's a Japanese art form. I know everybody knows about it by now because it's been, popularized and orientalized and what have you. And we can talk about the problems and the misgivings with all of that later. But it's kintsugi. Kintsugi, the art of taking broken kind of vases or broken materials and sticking them back together using sometimes golden glue or sometimes other things to add an aesthetic quality to the thing that would otherwise appear to have been broken. It's the idea that failure is a measure of the distance between where you are and success. It's not evidence of your inability to achieve. So if I'm aiming for a particular target and I miss that target, the distance by which I miss the target is the gap between where I am and where I'm trying to get to. It makes it more focused as opposed to less. It makes it more targeted as opposed to less. You get closer and better at what you're doing as opposed to worse. So the idea is that there shouldn't be any misgiving, or there needn't be, let's put it that way. There needn't be any misgivings or any hesitations about making mistakes on your path to perfection. Aim for it, fine. And if you make mistakes, that's what it takes to get there.
All right, so let's jump into practice number 2. And that is that you need to get comfortable killing your babies. Dr. E, only you can lay this one down. Why do they need to kill their babies?
All right. I mean, I feel a way about this one being my topic, but that's okay. I'll take it. It's fine. I'll confess, I did say to a student of mine not too long ago that her desire for perfection, the goals that she'd set in her head and the standards and the ideals that she'd set in her head, sometimes it's okay to take a samurai sword to them and just decapitate those ideals. Like, that's okay. Like, it's perfectly okay for you to think of all the goals and all the targets and all the things that you've set up in your head that are ending up acting as impediments and just take their heads off. That's all right. That's perfectly permissible. Look, what I'm saying here, in what we're saying here in terms of this issue, is that if we are comfortable making mistakes, as we said a moment ago, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with drafting your essay or your paper or your book or your PhD or your dissertation or whatever it is that you're working on at the time, or whatever it is that you're trying to produce at the time. Even if it's something outside of academia, it makes no difference. Whatever it is that you're trying to do, that you're procrastinating over because of the problem with perfection, whatever that issue is, there are no issues with taking a multiple draft approach to this, which basically means pushing out a draft for the first time and it's going to be terrible and it's just you and you alone that's going to see it, and then iterating that draft multiple times over, like doing it again and again and again and again until you get to the point that you're producing something that you think is of quality. I mean, there's a couple of things to remember here. Number one is that writing, and I mean handwriting, let me be clear about this, handwriting, not typing, but handwriting.
Old school.
Yeah, is a form of, you think I walk around with a pen in my hand for nothing. You think this is a prop. I'm just saying, what did you think I was doing 20 minutes ago? But writing is a form of thinking. I mean, you and I have had this conversation in the past about how people tend to misunderstand what the nature of work and thinking is and conceive that unless I'm sat in front of a laptop or unless I'm doing some typing or unless I'm doing something that appears to be what people tend to associate with thought or work, then I'm not actually thinking or working. Whereas you could very easily be working while you're going for a walk. You could very easily be working while you're feeding the kids. You could very easily be working while you're doing any number of other things, especially if your work is thought oriented as academic work tends to be. You kind of need to be able to multitask this way. Otherwise, what are you going to do? It's 24 hours in a day. So writing, the physical act of writing, is a form of thinking. And what it will do is externalize your thoughts. So you don't have to carry them in your head anymore. You know full well that everything that you were thinking, good or bad, is on a paper somewhere. So I can kind of put that aside and free up the space in my head for me to start to address other issues, or to start to even externalize my attitude toward that thought so that it's no longer a reflection of myself. It's just a standalone independent thought. And I can look at it on a piece of paper apart from and separate from me and assess it objectively without it then having to imply any values or meanings for who I am as a person or any of that stuff. Look, I'll sum it up like this. Samuel Beckett, famous playwright, writer, author, poet, whatever else you want to call him. But Samuel Beckett famously once said that there's a process of progressive failures towards achieving, not perfection, but at least achieving a decent standard. And what he said is, if you ever try to do anything, you ever failed, don't worry. Try again, fail better. It's not a question of actually achieving the thing. You're just going to do the thing, fail, and then fail again, but fail better each and every single time. And the reason that's the case is because your eyes are always going to be set on what the best could possibly be. So every single time you do something, you're going to be conscious of the gap between that and what you actually want to achieve, which means every single time you're doing something, you're just failing better. And then you leave it for everybody else to look back in awe at your work and declare perfection when they see it. See?
I think what we often see is students tend to put far too much effort into early drafts. And so what I mean by that is not necessarily too much effort, but too much effort into the wrong things in the early drafts. What we're proposing here is that you just write to get the stuff out of your head. Like, consider your brain as a hard drive with very limited space, and your number one task as the owner of that hard drive is to get that stuff backed up. And the way that you do that is you just offload it into written form as quickly as possible. And by having that approach where the first draft of your essay or your dissertation or whatever chapter it is you're working on, if you have this approach of, I'm just going to vomit my thoughts down onto this piece of paper, and then I'm going to come back to it, I'm going to circle around, and it's going to be version 2, version 3, version 4. If you have that approach, it really frees up your mind to focus on the things that matter. It really frees up your mind to be able to get the core threads, the key points that you want down onto a piece of paper, and then start shifting them around and moving them around, and perhaps being more strategic with how you're presenting them. And those things you can only do when you've got some sort of RAM or hard drive space freed up in your mind. You can't do that while you're still still trying to hold on to all of these thoughts and then rearrange them in your mind. So you really need to consider the paper as your sort of second brain, where you can just offload things, as opposed to the place where you need to somehow, for an audience of one, present perfect words the first time you're trying to articulate your thoughts, because that just doesn't work. So, in a nutshell, I guess what I'm trying to say is we see students spending a lot of time trying to create a really polished piece of writing on version 1 or version 2. And it's understandable, right? You feel like, well, let me just put in the effort now and I'm going to save time in the long run. But in reality, what you're going to achieve is you're going to get too committed and too attached to what you put down in those early stages, because you put so much effort into it, that you're not actually going to be able to let go of the parts that need to be let go of. And then you're going to end up with a piece of work that's subpar, as opposed to just thought vomiting and then cleaning up, and then perhaps thought vomiting a little bit more and then cleaning up, and going in this iterative cycle. And so this is really what we're getting at when we say get comfortable killing your babies, get comfortable just deleting large swaths of writing from your early drafts. And if it makes you feel better, you don't have to delete them. You can just create new versions and new versions and new versions of the document. So you still got all your babies, you just got them in backup mode there. But you want to adopt an approach or a mindset that says, I'm just going to get things out and then I'm going to improve upon them, as opposed to trying to get the perfect thing out on the first go.
Absolutely. And it's indicative of a failure to understand your position with respect to your own work. So this idea that everything that I do needs to be perfect on every single iteration of it. So every draft needs to be perfectly phrased and everything I write needs to be perfectly constructed. This conception that that's what you need to do is the failure to understand what it is that you're actually trying to achieve. I mean, as we said at the outset of this, you're supposed to be making mistakes. You're supposed to be going through this process and you're supposed to be learning as a consequence of it. So somewhere along the line, it's supposed to be the case that you're going to have a draft and then you're going to dump it away and start over again. I mean, the attachment to that draft is an indication of the failure to understand. You put the values in the wrong places. Look, I'll put it to you like this. There's concern with what the work looks like and with what people are going to think of me if they see this version of the draft, and whether or not it evidences that I'm actually good enough to achieve this, and all of these kind of larger, bigger questions, these things that you couldn't possibly really know, these things you couldn't possibly really prove with a draft of anything, or a first effort, or a second, or a third, or a fourth, or any effort that's before the final one or before the one that you actually submit. All of these are large, enormous questions that you're kind of burdening yourself with or burdening your mind with right now before you can actually get off and actually make meaningful progress in the work itself. There's a phrase, and I've mentioned this in the past, but there's a phrase from the Hagakure, the Japanese book that I've mentioned in the past, which is that matters of great concern should be treated very lightly. Matters of small concern should be treated very seriously. And those matters of great concern are the worries and the thoughts about whether or not I can achieve this, whether or not this is good enough, whether or not this is perfect, whether or not it's ideal. These are enormous concerns. These are enormous questions that you couldn't possibly begin to answer right now when you're starting with the early draft. And insofar as that's the case, they should be treated lightly. But those matters of small concern, the next sentence I need to write, that's the matter of small concern that's immediately in front of you. And that's the one that you're supposed to be attacking.
All right, so let's just recap what we've covered so far. We've said, in terms of beating this perfectionism thing, 2 practices are, firstly, to let perfection be your muse, not your master. And the second practice being that you need to get comfortable killing your babies. So hopefully these are useful. Well, they're definitely useful. But if you do still want to be a perfectionist, if you do still want to obsess over the perfect, then we have a third option that we can throw on the table, and that is that you need to redefine perfectionism as consistent practice. So, Dr. E, unpack it for us. What does this mean?
All right. So as we were indicating with the second way of dealing with this, or as I suggested with the second way of dealing with this, in fact, as we suggested with the first way of dealing with this, the fact of the matter is we're not saying, nor are we suggesting that having perfection or being great or being amazing shouldn't be a goal. By all means, set it as a goal. Being the best version of yourself on a day-to-day basis, that's not something that's an absurd goal. That should absolutely be a goal, by all means. So if you're going to be committed to that, Fine. There's even a way to do that. Don't ever think we didn't do enough for you. See, I found a way around the problem too. There's an answer to this as well. But my point is, if that's what you're going to commit to, that's okay. But it's understanding where that value is placed. It's what I was suggesting a moment ago, which is to say that your perfection is not found in the product. It's found in the path that you're pursuing. It's perfection of endurance. It's perfection of commitment. It's perfection, and critically, as praxis. Let me be clear about what I mean by praxis here. It's moving correctly in everything that you do and trying to focus yourself on doing so, which means correct movement means the acceptance that you are not master of all things, and that sometimes the wind will blow a certain way and it's going to mess you up. That sometimes the ground will shake underneath you and you're not going to walk as straight or as perfect as you want to. That sometimes things change and that you're going to have to adjust your approach, and as a consequence, things might fall by the wayside. These things happen. You have to permit yourself the room to be able to make mistakes. That's okay. These things are perfectly permissible. It's a question of your commitment to the path. Do you constantly try to take another step? Are you constantly trying to improve yourself with every single effort you make? Are you committed to doing what it is that you're supposed to be doing, which means pushing out the next draft and then getting better with this one, pushing out the draft after that and getting better with that one, reading that book that you were terrified of reading to make sure you understand the content, and then writing the summaries as poorly as you're going to before you write them again until you get better at them, whatever it takes. I mean, I won't accept anything from anybody that says some things are too difficult to do. For one, that's never going to be my mantra. There is no such thing. I don't know. Let me just put this as an aside. I don't know if you've looked at human history or not, but the idea that some things are too difficult to achieve is an absurdism. Like there was a time when we were cavemen, and there's a time now when we're talking about terraforming planets. Like it's a different thing. Don't play with me and tell me that like there's some things that are unachievable. We're looking at Mars talking about, I wonder if I can make that look like Earth. Stop it. There's very little that we can't do if you set your mind to it correctly. And I understand there's generations of work on this, but that kind of tells you something in and of itself. Even those people who set that as a goal for themselves did it knowing full well they were never going to be able to see the realization of that goal, but they committed themselves to a practice. They committed themselves to a repetition of something that even then they knew I wasn't necessarily going to be able to see the fruits of, but that wasn't the point. Achieving perfection wasn't a question of not making a mistake or getting everything that I want or the immediacy of the goal. That wasn't what it was. It was a commitment to a path, and it will always be that. So, putting to one side the philosophical thing, there are practical steps, which basically means setting achievable, small goals within time limits. Like within time limits, and what's achievable small goals that permit of procrastination, and you're going to keep telling yourself for the next 3 weeks, I'm still trying to read this one essay. It's setting small, highly achievable goals. And yeah, sure, even celebrating the process and your progress as you tick off those goals, and focusing on the momentum of that process instead of the perfection that comes as a consequence of it. It's the repetition of action. I mean, I've said this on numerous previous occasions. It's so common. Even Denzel Washington said it at some point or another, but you just get better at anything that you do repeatedly. So bear this in mind. If you're repeatedly procrastinating, you are going to become a supreme procrastinator. If on the other hand, you are repeatedly putting out drafts of the work that you're supposed to be doing, guess what you're going to get good at? The work you're supposed to be doing. It's that simple. Wisdom indeed. I think it's really, to reinforce what you just said, it's really about the small things that you're doing every day. In other words, the habits in your life. And you really need to focus on what actions are you taking every day that don't need to be massive actions, but what small intentional actions are you taking every day towards these goals that you've set. And again, the goals themselves don't need to be massive. They don't need to be long-term. They don't need to be world-changing or perfect. It's really just about deciding, what am I going to do this month, this week, this day, this hour, and sticking to it and actually doing it every day. And I love the concept of 1% better. If you're aiming to just get 1% better at something every day, the compounding effect of that is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. So yeah, perhaps you're not a great writer now and you want to create this perfect piece of writing. Well, how do you do that? You do it every day. You just focus on getting something out every day. That doesn't mean you need to write for 8 hours every day, but it means at least write for 5 minutes and do that every day, and you're going to get better. So it's really important to emphasize the consistent practice component that we headlined here. It's all about consistent practice. It's not about some massive action that you take once and then never do it again. It's not about blowing the lights out on one occasion. It's really about deciding, what do I want to achieve? What are the small actions that I need to take every single day to achieve that, and then getting down to doing them. It's exactly that. And it means that progress over perfection is this idea that the end goal is a byproduct of the process. It's not the target. It means that rather than saying to yourself that I've got this kind of like goal that I've set for myself at a distance from me, and that, I have to climb over these mountains and overcome all of these obstacles and get over all of these impediments to be able to arrive at the holy grail of this dissertation being perfect or whatever that is. No. Instead, it's you're trying to perfect. It's you're trying to get better. It's you're trying to get smarter, faster, writing better, whatever it might happen to be, whatever your goals and your targets are. It's you that are getting better at this, because ideally it would be the case. Ideally, it would be the case that whenever you put your mind to something, it tends to be better than it was yesterday. But the only way you can do that is not by focusing on the goal itself. It's focusing on the work ethic that you put in. It's making sure, exactly as you said, that you're constantly committed to the endurance and the practice of repeating that process over and over again until you get better and better and better. It's that idea. And the consequence of that is, it's the path I'm focused on, not the product or not the destination or not the goal. It's not that. These things come as a consequence or a byproduct of my excellence. And what I'm saying is the illusion of the end goal is an arbitrary standard, and it's indicative of a formal institutional process rather than a substantive, meaningful, actual goal in the course of your life. What you're trying to get better at is yourself. I'm getting better at being me every single day. There's a little story. I'll tell you this and I'll leave it alone, I promise. But there's a little story like this. It's an old story. I think I may have mentioned this in the past, but for those that don't know, gather around, kids. You know what I mean? Gather around, light a fire, something like that, get yourself a hot chocolate, something like that, gather around. Little story. But the story goes like this. There's a story of a Japanese farmer who loses his horses one morning. They break out of the farm and they disappear. And as a consequence of that, all of his neighbors come around to his house and knock on the door and be like, hey, condolences, and we're sorry that you've suffered all of these losses, and it's terrible that this has happened to you, so on and so forth. And his only response to this is, yeah, maybe. And then they go away. The following day, his son goes out to go and try and get those horses. And not only does he get the horses that they lost, but he brings back some new ones. So now the neighbors want to knock on his door and congratulate him. And his only response is, yeah, maybe. The following day, his son is out trying to train these new horses, and in trying to break the new one in, he ends up falling off and breaking his arm. So now again, the neighbors want to knock on his door, talking about, oh, my condolences, now your son can't work with you, it's going to cut your income in half, so on and so forth. His only response is, yeah, maybe. Then the next day, the army comes knocking by on his door, looking for young, fit men who are going to go to war with them so they can go and fight at the front lines of whatever it is battle they're trying to fight. And they realize that his son has got a broken arm and he can't go to the fight. Long story short, what I'm saying is that the same event that started this process off, that loss of the horses in the first instance that seemed like such a loss, is the same one that ends up producing this good point and this negative point and this good point and this negative point and this win and this loss and this win and this loss and this win and this loss. And throughout that whole process of getting better and getting worse, of getting what you want and making mistakes and not making mistakes and doing really well and not doing really well, that whole process, the response is always maybe, because we're not at the end yet. We haven't arrived at the goal. We haven't arrived at the finish line. We haven't arrived at the point where we can look back at this and say, okay, that was perfect or that wasn't, because it's not over yet. And your journey isn't over with the production of a piece of paper or an essay or a dissertation or anything to that effect. Your journey is expressed in part by that, but it's reinforced and it's made perfect by your commitment to the effort and to your practice of what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. So long as you're sticking to that, you've got nothing to worry about.
Wise words. Dr. E, as always, it's been real, it's been good. It hasn't been perfect, thankfully, but the Japanese proverbs and anecdotes, I like that we're keeping this going.
Yeah, man, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much. This is light work. This is just what I do in the mornings before I start getting perfect. This is where all my mistakes happen. I catch you at the end of my journey. I tell you how it went.
All right, so that wraps up this episode of the Grad Coach Podcast. If you got value from this video or from this podcast, please do remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and you'll definitely want to check out this video next. I'll see you there.